Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Mark Vermette. I'm with Halloran Consulting. We do organizational and process consulting in the life sciences arena. And I'm really happy to be here with my colleague and partner in Cytel and Angelo presenting this morning. I'm going to kick off today by talking about some of the challenges that many of you are probably pretty aware of. What Halloran's seeing in the market today is just an explosion of data, and more of it's coming in electronically. Some of the metrics that we're seeing are, the expansive collection of data, starting with wearables now, which are becoming companion devices in a lot of studies. We're seeing wearable traffic actually coming into EDC systems at this point. And, of course, lab data has been part of the picture for quite some time, but that lab data is being transmitted routinely now into databases and is becoming a bigger part of the picture because a lot of the studies that we're working with customers on, lab data actually shows a lot of the outcome data and a lot of the endpoint data. So the point is that we're swimming in data, and the importance of getting that data standardized so that people can look at it, analyze it, and submit it to the regulatory authorities is becoming a bigger challenge. And, of course, we know that there's also a lot of legacy studies out there. So today's presentation between myself and Angelo, we're going to try and show you a picture of not only what that looks like, but also how to get to where you need to be with CDISC standards. The landscape is also changing in terms of how we conduct studies. Halloran's working with a number of device companies and pharmaceutical companies that are currently collecting data directly into their repositories from a number of devices that were actually used in an integration pattern prior. So we're seeing a lot of sensor technology. We're certainly seeing integrated devices. In some cases, our device customers themselves are actually pumping device data directly from home devices into repositories at this point. And that data is being aggregated with what I would consider traditional clinical study data to show a much bigger picture of efficacy and compliance and how the product is working. So all of these things require an understanding of how do you deploy standards, how do you bring this data together in a way that makes sense, and then simultaneously, how do you provide this data out to multiple stakeholders? And it used to be that stakeholders included, the providers themselves, which, are the doctors, as well as the sponsors, but now we're seeing a lot more interaction between the regulatory authorities. And, of course, there are some regulations that are on the horizon that are going to increase that collaboration requirement. So the point here is that it's not simply user input data or site input data anymore. There's data coming from a lot of different places, and that needs to be considered in your planning and execution regarding standards. Like I said, on the tail end, this is also changing quite a bit. Most of our customers at Halloran, and I'm sure with Cytel as well, are dealing with issues that were previously looked at in late-phase studies or even post-marketing, where you were working with payers and providers to make sure that the benefits and the ROI and the financial aspects of a product were up to speed, but also with policy 0070 coming in and other scenarios, both regulatory and business-wise, there are a lot of cases where this data needs to be made available real-time to the broad spectrum of stakeholders, including patients. So, patient post-marketing studies have been conducted for quite some time, but the real-time audience and extending data out to the public is becoming a real part of the picture. So that can be done in a proprietary format, clearly, but as organizations begin to look across their portfolio of studies, the requirement for standardization is really important. And one of the things that Angelo will certainly bring up is that you certainly want to make the consumers of that data happy. In the case of regulatory authorities, they really need to be on the same page as you are, and the data needs to be accessible and in a format that they can understand and appreciate. And he'll get into some more details about that with his presentation, but it's not simply enough to provide access to this data. It needs to be carefully thought out, and there needs to be some standards and consistency around that. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about CDISC today, but I wanted to emphasize that CDISC is an outstanding standard. There's been many contributions to it, but there's benefits to it beyond regulatory submissions and simply keeping the regulators happy and keeping other partners happy. When you think of implementing CDISC as a programmatic step, you can create CRFs faster, you can create SDTM data sets faster, you can do reporting and analytics faster by using ATOM data sets. And I'll get into this in a minute in the next slide about where these fit in the life cycle. But, standardizing allows you to maintain a higher level of quality across your data because you're consistently checking fields and you're consistently using the same nomenclature. If you look ahead and up front and you're using standards to develop your eCRFs and reusing those, then, you've completed a lot of the standardization up front in the study design, the EDC deployment, and that makes the SDTM mappings and producing your data files go a lot faster. We do realize that people live in a legacy environment. There are studies and data that are out there from multiple partnerships, and for that reason, you have to make some choices as to which data you standardize and when you do that. We'll certainly get into that in the presentation this morning. So, regulatory compliance, you're seeing regulators be a lot more consistent on their requests in terms of collaboration with sponsors and development companies where they're requiring or asking for CDISC compliance. So it has been optional and requested, but it's our point of view as a consulting firm that it's becoming more and more mandatory, both from a business perspective as well as a regulatory perspective. This slide comes from CDISC website, which I highly suggest that you use as a reference. They've done a very good job of putting together materials, although the specifications themselves and the entire landscape of standards can be fairly confusing. So it's helpful to have peers and partners help guide when and where each of these standards should be applied, and certainly Angelo is going to get into that today. But three of the standards I really wanted to point out on this slide are the CDISC standard, the SDTM standard, and the ATOM standard. And CDISC is really developed as a standard for helping design and build data inputs, specifically eCRFs and EDC. And it does map to SDTM, and there's several pieces of information that are available through the CDISC website about how these standards integrate with each other and how they vary. And I'll make this simple in that CDISC standards are really meant, and this is quite predictable, CDISC standards are really positioned around human-readable data formats and formats that would allow an individual to be able to look at the data and understand what it is. Whereas SDTM, I would argue, is a more technical standard and is used for data interchange as well as integration between systems. ATOM is the standard for data analysis, which can be used at any point in the study. And we're seeing ATOM data sets being used a lot more frequently for analysis, data management, and biostats as the study's progressing. So those three standards are really kind of the epicenter of the discussion today and a lot of the work that CDISC has been doing. And, clearly one of the benefits of using CDISC standards is that, these standards have evolved over time. There's been a lot of input from the industry, and there's a lot of experience to be shared about those. And there are implementation guides that will help companies understand, the extent of these standards, and I have some templates to help them progress in implementing the standards themselves. So one last thing before I turn it over to Angelo to talk through implementation and planning is the whole data cycle. So like I said, we understand that, trials are being conducted under different models with different partner strategies. In some cases, they've been done a number of years ago, but they're still relevant in terms of, having that data available based on product results. And so, we need to make some careful decisions, and a lot of this is based on, environment, product, maturity, those types of things, about, which trial data sets would be, standardized based on SDTM. But when those decisions are made, having a carefully curated CDISC interpretation is important, and pushing those into standardized data sets. And those standardized data sets can be in a central repository, which is quite common for sponsors as well as CROs. But also standardized data set can be used for exchange between partners, either for analytics purposes or for purposes of submission to the regulatory authorities. So the use of CDISC is not specifically conjoined with the concept and the strategy of building a data warehouse, although it very well could be, in often cases is. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to my peer, Angelo, and have him take the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, for passing me the ball, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night for all the people that are in the call all around the world. So my name is Angelo Tinazzi. I'm Director of Standard System and CDISC Consulting in the Statistical Programming Group of Cytel. I'm based here in Geneva, Switzerland, not far from the Alps, not far from the lakes, so a very beautiful place. So let's see if okay. So in the next, let's say, I hope 30 minutes that we have enough time for questions. After the overview of the need of standard made by Mark, I will provide some hints on what are the current requirements when submitting data as a part of a regulatory submission to the FDA. So why the FDA? That's because FDA was the first agency starting adopting standards such as the CDISC that we just discussed, and it is actually one of the main drivers and also influencer in the CDISC standard development. And other agencies, however, like the Japanese agency or the PMDA, are also similar process. I also do understand today in the call there's quite a set of heterogeneous audience, more than what I usually have when I present similar topic at conference such as the CDISC interchange. So I really do hope, I'm confident too, that the information we provide today will motivate people to move more toward the use of the standard. However, for those that are already on board with the standard, they can either find confirmation on their understanding on the whole process based on what we did experience at Cytel, but maybe there can be also something new for them too. I know also there are some expectations about receiving some valuable information about the CD standard in details. So what's new, for example. I do recommend to stay tuned with the available official CDISC events, either the interchange, the webinar, or the training, where you can learn more about the standard and then how to properly use them. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to start by introducing the history and rationale where we are today with the FDA requirements. So beginning with December 2016, so the 17 exactly, All clinical trials and non-clinical trial studies started after this date must use standard when submitting data to the FDA. So, and this is applicable for new drug or new biological license application, but as well as for abbreviated new drug application for the approval of generic drug products. Also, some commercial investigation on new drugs are also concerned by this requirement with the delay of 12 months compared to the December 2016. So the guidance mainly apply to divisions, so the division charge for drug and the division charge for the biological license. However, other divisions, such as the one regulated devices, while they do not mandate yet the use of this standard, they do recommend or suggest as a possible standard to be used when a data submission is made to the division. They recommend to use the same standard recommended by the CDISC and CBER division. So overall, this was the outcome of a process started in the US back in 2012 with the aim of improving and speed up the review process so that new promising drugs can be made available to patients sooner than before. However, as you can see from the chart, data submission was already a requirement at the FDA, so it was nothing new. But very few recommendations were given to the sponsor at that time on the way data sets should be formatted and prepared, and no standard were available at that time. So the only standard was the data exchange standard, the so-called transport file. So this was resulting in having the FDA receiving data in a different fashion, let me say. So the outcome of this process end up with the development of three key guidance that were released at the same time in 2014. The first one here in the slide, it can be considered a parent guidance in the series of documents, and its primary objective is of this guidance is to affirm that as soon as December 2016, you will need to submit most, if not all, the application I mentioned before in an electronic format. So the objective here is to replace, basically, is to replace paper, and it is also the guidance is covering is about timing. The second guidance is instead following on the requirement most, not all submission must be electronic. This guidance states that the study initiated after December 2016 should utilize specific data standards for the collection, analysis, and delivering of both clinical and non-clinical trial data. The guidance also introduced the concept of FDA data standard catalog that I will touch in a while, where all the standard and the version of the standard accepted by the FDA are maintained. All the two guidance just discussed, they are binding, so meaning they are mandatory, and you are obliged to follow them if you plan to submit data to the FDA. The last guidance instead is not binding, but the agency expects you to follow. So, in a few words, it's binding as well, although it's not considered binding. So, the aim of this guidance is to provide, with this guidance, the FDA aims to provide additional specification on top of those that are covered by the standard guidance. So that so that people can also provide more uniform data, because sometimes even if you apply standard, you may have a different understanding and different understanding of some aspects of the standard. So, and the guidance is applicable, as I said at the beginning, to the two divisions, the CDISC and the CBER. Guidance is also updated regularly. So currently, the plan is to update the guidance every 6 months, so usually March and October. And every time there is a new version, usually the FDA, they run a webinar where they introduce any new aspects introduced with the new version. So I recommend to stay tuned with the FDA. So the webinars are free of charge, and they are valuable to be up to date with their requirements. So as previously mentioned, the study data technical conformance guidance, so the last guidance I introduced in the previous slide, introduced the concept of a standard catalog. In essence, the standard catalog is simply an Excel file containing two spreadsheets listing the accepted data exchange standard, such as the SAS transport file, and the CDISC data format previously mentioned. And the different versions allowed to be used are also mentioned. So, for example, some older versions of CDs of SCTM are no longer accepted. And also, to be noted that there may be a gap between the moment where a standard or a new version of an existing standard is released by the organization in charge for maintaining the standard, like CDISC. So there may be a gap by the moment the standard becomes available and the time when the standard is added to the catalog. The reason why is that because FDA needs some time to validate the new standard, the new version, before making it available. So they need to make sure they can handle the new standard. This is, however, not the case for the other additional guidance issued by the CDISC, such as the therapeutic area standard. This kind of guidance, they do not introduce any new standard, but rather they extend the CDISC implementation guidance by providing some, by covering some specificity pertaining to specific indication. So here in the slide, you can see some examples. So there's probably this is not the entire spreadsheet, but you can see that for Adam, they are currently accepting the two existing version, and there's also a plan for retiring the older version. And the standard catalog, together with other FDA resources, can be reached at the following at the website others I mentioned below in the slide. And the second spreadsheet instead is the available medical dictionary that must be used, for example, when submitting adverse events. So it is mandatory to utilize the MedDRA dictionary. And also the catalog mandates the use of standard CDISC control terminology for any data that you have submitted, for example, in the SDTM dataset. So if I take the slide that Mark has used in his presentation, okay, something not working in the animation of this slide. Okay, these are the standards that are required by the FDA when you submit data as a support of a new product registration. And as you can see, CDISC is not required. The only required standard on this slide are the SCTM, the ADAM, and the SEND. SEND is equivalent to SCTM, but it's for non-clinical data. And also the control terminology is mandatory to be used. There are also other requirements. The animation will work, all right, to consider that are listed in the catalog. And these are, you can see, these are also discussed in the backup slide in case you want to have more details. And these are about, for example, the requirement for portable, for PDF file, and also the requirement for building the electronic common technical documents. And in there, for example, there are specific reference to a location where standard submitted data have to be placed when the electronic common technical document is provided to the FDA. So one important aspect for a successful data submission is the early plan and the early communication with the agency. And very often in the past, we have seen sponsors approaching us to help with their submission, with the unrealistic timeline, without even any pre-discussion with the FDA about how data should be provided and in which format. So the situation illustrated in this picture is becoming more and more rare, but thanks to the new developed process. But the message here is that data submission, more in general, submission is a multidisciplinary effort, and as such, key people with a specific expertise should be involved in the discussion with the reviewer, and not only the regulatory folks. But on the other hand, these key people should make an effort in educating the regulatory people or any other function that has no technical skills related to data submission and use of standard. I'm thinking about some project manager in charge of, for example, selecting a CRO. So sponsors have the opportunity to interact with the reviewer at different stages during the clinical development process. For example, the sponsor can call to regulate the process, can call for the so-called pre-NDA type meeting with the purpose of discussing and finding a final agreement on the strategy for both clinical efficacy and clinical safety in support to the registration of a new drug. And the typical topic for this meeting can be the discussion of the type of trials, the efficacy point that the sponsor are choosing, and at one point also the pooling strategy. At that time, as shown here in the example, the sponsor should also find a final agreement on which study should be part of the submission and which data will be required and in which format. The trick here is also to formulate the question in a way that you already provide an answer that is actually your preferred approach. And luckily, if everything is well formulated and if your proposal makes sense, the FDA will accept that. With the FDA Study Data Technical Performance Guide, the agency actually recommends to start this before the NDA, the JNDA meeting, and if not already at the time of the IND, at least at the end of the phase 2. And in this guidance, also they recommend to use the so-called study data standardization plan or something similar, where you can define the standardization within a particular program when meeting the agency. And currently also the agency is recommending the use of one template that's been developed under the FUSE initiative, and you can see here on the slide the link to the template. And the document, in essence, serves as an inventory for planned, ongoing, and completed non-clinical, but also clinical study. And the format the sponsor intend to use and provide, in case standard format is not used, provide the rationale why the standard format could be not used, assuming there is a good rationale. The document is also an ongoing live document, and in a later stage could also cover topics such as pooling strategy. And I also like to emphasize that the fact that despite CRO like us, so we did on a couple of occasions, we could help drafting the plan, but definitely it's the sponsor, the owner of this document, as such, they are responsible to initiate, to develop and maintain the document. So this is an example of possible content of these documents. Basically, it's the inventory of all the studies that are currently planned, ongoing, and closed. And with this document, you anticipate the type of standard that you want to use, so the STM, the ADAM, and also the dictionary and the version of the dictionary you're going to use. So with that, in the end of the reviewer, the agency can already make an assessment if you are making that something that is violating the requirement. Because the current version of the CD standard are actually developed to mainly support single study, and although there are some CDISC teams that are working on developing a new standard or in a format of recommendation to better integrate data from multiple studies, when, how, and what to pull to support either the integrated summary safety or the integrated summary efficacy, at the moment it's open to different approaches. And in this example, this is an example of a study data standardization plan where the sponsor has proposed an approach on how to pull data into ADAM. And this sponsor in particular was supplementing a previous successful NDA where the pool was already done in ADAM. And the proposal of the sponsor was to integrate the ADAM developed for the analysis of the new study to the previous pool ADAM. And also here the sponsor was anticipating a possible issue, that is when you pull information from study conducted, I would say, in a different area with different version of the standard, you may have some discrepancy. So the sponsor was already anticipating in this text a possible solution. This approach was accepted by the FDA, although it is not standard, as I said. But the recommendation here is to the fact that the agency accepted that approach for a submission doesn't mean the approach could be used for another submission. So the recommendation is always to check with the reviewer. Another important topic and recommendation from the study data conformance guide, it's the FDA encouraging to contact the technical team at the FDA for any question related to data standard. Questions do not necessarily need to be related to a specific study, so they can be independent from any submission. And the sponsor is also encouraged to make a test data submission, and this is, although it's not a mandatory step, it is a great opportunity for the sponsor to clarify some technical doubt for the upcoming data submission. And this is intended to be a submission of real study that will be part of the official submission, completed of all the needed documentation, such as the fine XML that was mentioned in the previous slide, with all these standards, and the reviewer guide that we'll touch in the next slide. The test could include both SDTM and ADAM, and the suggestion is to maybe choose a tricky study where you have maybe some doubt on the way things have been implemented, and you may get some good suggestion from the technical person in charge at the FDA for making the review of your test submission. But do not expect any detailed review of your data because the person in charge for reviewing your test submission is not a reviewer. But in our experience, we really see a very, very good technical comments. So one kind of promise we made in our webinar announcement was to give some insight into some critical success factors for preparing a compliance submission. So that will be the focus of the remaining part of my presentation. So one of the key questions is when it is a good time to start adopting CD standard. Although I think from the part covered by Mark, this is pretty clear. So the suggestion is to start now, and to start from CDISC. So very often people are worried about the impact on the organization, since introducing new standard require also new process to be defined, and possible some budget for that. So starting with CDISC, as mentioned before, it is not required by the FDA. However, if applied right at the start of the data collection, it can save a lot of time when they're moving to SDTM first and later on to ADAM. As per some data provided by some CDISC folks at the Fuse conference last year, CDASH do not only overlap with SDTM for about 70% when data are transformed from CDASH to SDTM, meaning there is a one-to-one match between an item in CDASH to an item in SDTM. And this rate increase, reaching the 86% when other standard, let me call it this way, standard post-processing transformation are applied. For example, the way data are represented in CDASH versus SDTM. So if adopted, it could also improve the quality of the data collected, since you are adopting a standard terminology from the very beginning, and thus you somehow avoid the range of choice, meaning that people could not use different terms to refer, for example, to the same medical concept. And in the end, you may limit the data variability between regions, countries, and sites. That's correct. Yes. So adopting. So among the if the issue, the challenges that you may face if you don't start with standard from the very beginning, and you decide to adopt standard retrospectively, so the so-called legacy data migration, may pose very severe traceability issues. So, and I will introduce the traceability concept later on. So the use of standard not only improves the quality of the data, but to a certain extent, it helps the collection of the right information. So, although now quite improbable, I saw some relatively recent study not collecting, for example, the seriousness criteria. And this is required by the kind of required field by the FDA, because with that they can make sure your assessment of the seriousness was appropriate. Also, the so-called migration of legacy data, that is data collected without using study data format. So the use of the migration of legacy data at the time of submission has the risk of not getting and we had such issue in our experience working with some sponsor. There is the risk of not getting the same results compared to when you analyze your data with the legacy format. And again, we come back in a minute on that, with the possible risk of delaying your submission timeline. So and also the retrospective SDTM migration could be very challenging, especially when done several years after a study has been completed. This is just an example from a study migration we did in the past. And you can see the data collection tool at the time were not developed with CDASH principle in mind, and nor the use of standard control terminology. And this results in a big effort on translating original terms to the equivalent term in the standard terminology. And of course, if there is any doubt about the term, there is no way to go back and ask for clarification if the study was completed several years ago. And similarly, for the another example here, where for the similar same medical concept, like for example for concomitant medication, several data sets were created to store the same information that actually map to one concept, one data set in SDTM. So, as mentioned before, the late adoption of CD standard can put at risk the traceability of the study flow. And traceability in this context assumes you are following a linear process, meaning you store your data in ADC, hopefully adopting the CDISC standard. You create from it the SDTM dataset, from which then you derive analysis ADAM dataset by, for example, creating derived variables or where you may impute missing information to, of course, to some kind of agreed process to support your statistical analysis. And then the created analysis will be used to create, to feed the clinical study report. However, if any of the step is missing or skipped, the traceability is broken. And for example, when a decision is taken to migrate to STM retrospectively, and eventually Adam is derived from this STM. In this case, the clinical study report that was created prior to the decision to migrate will not, of course, be using the STM and the Adam, and it may be therefore not be possible to reproduce the results. And this is also was one concern in one recent FDA webinar, where they actually reported a real example where the reviewer found a subject was not identified in the analysis dataset as having died, while there was an adverse event in the AE-STM dataset that had that outcome. And there was no way for the reviewer to reconcile the discrepancy because the analysis dataset were not in Adam and they were not derived in STM. So in a way, you try to submit to, in a way, what you try to achieve to submit doesn't match what you have in reality done. Trying to speed up a little bit so that we have time for questions. So despite the regulatory agencies such as the FDA has endorsed CDISC as a standard, there are some different rules or requirements that need to be taken into account. This is posing some challenges as the sponsor have on one side to adhere to the standard and at the same time have to consider additional requirements rule from the regulatory agency where they intend to submit. And most of the time, these additional requirements have been developed with the aim of reducing variability when standard offer two or more options. But as you can see in the example mentioned here, they can pose challenges when you are required, for example, to do in a CTM something you're not supposed to do, deriving an information, or where no consensus is currently available for items like the choice of standard laboratory unit for the standard unit for laboratory. There are more examples in the backup slide, by the way. Very often sponsors come to us requesting our support for an upcoming data submission, and very often the sponsors have preferred CRO partners, sometimes multiple preferred CRO partners, and especially with small biotech with limited operational resources, there is somehow a lack or no oversee at all of what has been asked to the CRO and what the CRO is delivering when it comes to provide the CDISC compliant package. We understand small companies have limited resources, but when you source important projects, you need to at least make sure your partner provide the compliant package like the STM dataset, and where possibly standard and terminology have been applied consistently across the study. Some of our sponsors, even the one with limited operational staff, succeed in developing process for controlling the work of their partners by developing some kind of light governance process and having its own way of applying standard and provide some specification to external partners could also facilitate the work of the partners for the CRO, avoiding possible mistake or misunderstanding. So last topic I want to cover, kind of challenges is so although applying standard can help improving the quality of your data, but also standard are not yet perfect, let me say. And the availability of standard validation checks in line with the standard rules defined in the standard and their implementation in some available tools permits the verification of developed data sets against the standard principle. But often people forget to perform this important step or underestimate the importance of discussing openly any open issue with the reviewer. So one way of discussing this issue, as the FDA recommends, it is the use of a reviewer guide together with the submitted data set. And the reviewer guide is the document that could accompany the data package, and it will facilitate the understanding of the content and characteristics of the data set you have submitted. And typically, a reviewer guide is the place where you discuss any special consideration, any conformance issue that may facilitate the reviewer using your data. And this is an example, a real example in one study where the standard validation checks detected an error in the adverse events data set, but these were basically the adverse events end date was after the last disposition date, so it was after the study date. This was because the sponsor, as per Study Data Management Convention, allowed the investigator to collect some adverse events follow-up data after the patient was off study. So in the reviewer guide, we provide the explanation, and hopefully it was enough for the reviewer. But there are also cases on studies that we receive from other company or from other CRO, where actually we have seen errors or warnings that could have been fixed. Some are very, very basic. And when we saw this error, we checked in the reviewer guide, and this was the explanation provided in the reviewer guide. So these are issues that have to be fixed. So simply saying that the issue is because there was an error is not enough. And this was also, again, in the FDA webinar, this was, again, this similar example was made. And you have to bear in mind that in future, the agency may automatically delay the submission if a significant number of errors or critical warnings will be detected in the submitted data set. This is, again, another example, but I think I can skip that. So we reach the conclusion, so just a disclaimer, a kind of special disclaimer. Usually disclaimer I put at the beginning of the presentation. I did put at the end on purpose. So here the message that despite the content of our presentation contain information coming from existing requirement from CDISC or from FDA, they represent our experience applying standard and interacting with the FDA. So as such, I recommend always to check with the reviewer. So these are some conclusion. I don't know now, Mark, if you want to do that with me, or if we open, if you want to have some final consideration, or if you want to open to question.
No, I appreciate that, Angelo. I think, I really appreciate what you were saying as far as methodically implementing the standards. I do want to reemphasize that, if you can programmatically develop, the processes for using these standards consistently as you start to design your studies, I think, the benefits, both financially and from an efficiency point of view, start to play out pretty quickly. So, it is important to, look backward at data that's available and get it into a shape that it can be analyzed and submitted, and to do that in a way that, the regulatory authorities, and particularly the FDA, really understands ahead of time what you're going to be sending them. But, for those people who are on the phone and for industry participants that have multiple studies in the pipeline, it's hard for me not to say, if you can start programmatically implementing CDISC standards up front, it makes things a whole lot easier on the tail end. And that might take some time in terms of planning, and it certainly might take some coaching from people who've been through it before. So I appreciate the presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions that are out there with you, Angelo.
And hi, this is Mike Weitz, and I'm here together with Karen Ozer here in Waltham, Mass. And we're going to moderate the questions now for Angelo and Mark, and your questions as well. So please continue to post your questions. Joe Mowney, we see your question, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Karen, I'm the director of marketing here at Cytel. I'm the one who, if you registered via the email invitations, these came from me. And joining me, as I mentioned, is Karen Ozer. And Karen is a director and a head of biostats here at Cytel and works closely, as you imagine, with Angelo. So actually, Karen, before we get to the questions from the audience, Karen, you had a question about the CDISC standards and how they may differ for different regulatory agencies.
Yeah, and I think that both Angelo as well as Mark might be able to contribute to this question. And the question is, are there any other regulatory agencies in the world requiring data submission using the CDISC standards? So, Angelo, do you want to take that first, and then maybe Mark can contribute to that after?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned during my presentation, the other agency that is moving quickly toward the data standard requirements, the PMDA, so the Japanese authorities. They had a very similar process, very similar to the one FDA had, very similar to the one that I presented at the beginning. So they also have the concept of data catalogs, standard data catalogs. And the key difference is that the moment when requirements will start at PMDA, my opinion, PMDA chose a more pragmatical approach. So they said, okay, any submission that we receive after sometime in April 2012 will be needed to be submitted using the standard, while the requirement from the FDA, it's based on the start date of each single study. So that's the main difference, but there are also other very little differences, and also other, and I also have a slide in the backup part. Other authorities like the Chinese FDA and the Canada authorities, they are totally not yet ready to receive data submission in a standard format. They endorse CDISC, meaning that as soon as they are ready, they will use CDISC. While unfortunately, there's no yet any signal from the EMEA, so from the European authority.
Thank you. And Mark, were you going to comment further?
No, just to echo what Angelo says. I think although the focus of CDISC and CDISC data sets has been with the FDA, it's certainly quickly advancing into the EU. And there are some we don't have to get into them here, but there are some regulations that are coming up into play around data transparency and whatnot. And I think that's going to accelerate this whole process as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. Actually, we have a question from Tim. Tim Holland asks, which is a really elementary question, but absolutely key. Tim mentions, he asks, is it necessary to have the CDISC standards in place when conducting phase 1 studies? And I know we've had a lot of discussion about that with clients as well. Maybe Mark and Angelo, you can share your thoughts.
I'll let Angelo go first.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Actually, it's a kind of a repeated question from our trial, from our sponsor. But so the message before answering to the question, I want to repeat the message we want to give today. So the CDISC adopting a standard is not just for submission, so it's also help streamlining your process. So you do not need to integrate information from different trials with the only scope of submission. You may also have other opportunity of other needs for pooling data, like for example for safety surveillance, for regular safety surveillance for your product. And I would say, first of all, of of course, it depends if the study will be part of the submission. So if it will contribute to, for example, to the integrated summary of safety. But as for the specifically for the FDA, so this there's no clear indication. However, it's possible that if you're talking about healthy volunteer patient, it's possible that this, except some QT and QTC study, it is possible that it will be very likely that this study will be not part of the submission. So this could, so the migration of this, the adoption of the standard for this study may be delayed. However, I can tell you that we are working with some company, even small company, that regardless of the phase of the study, they decided to go straight with CDISC. Also because, especially a small biotech, one day they may have some interest, some other company interested in their compound, and this company, they may ask for data, and if you have to transition for example, your compound to the new company, having everything in standard would facilitate the process. That's the answer I can provide.
Mark, unless you have a further question, we're gonna move on with another topic area that Karen's going to address.
Yeah, no, that would be fine. That would be fine.
Okay. So, Angelo, oftentimes there's certain studies that are required to be within an NDA, and if they're not in CDISC format, what are the consequences if we don't follow the standards?
Well, if the study starts after December 2016, there may be a risk of a technical rejection from the FDA, meaning that if, for example, you submit a study and the study started after this date, the FDA will probably ask you to resubmit the data set, the study in a standard format, and as such, there is a risk of delay in the submission process. But then, study starts instead before December 2016. Then it's all about the need you have to do of data of the study. But of course, if the study needs to be pooled together with the other study, the study has to be converted to STTM.
I think, Angelo hit the nail on the head. I think I mentioned it earlier in the presentation was, the whole idea is to keep the regulators happy, and that's not meant to contrive the system as much as it is, with common sense that, as much as you can ease the review process, the better off you are. So even though the consequences for earlier studies may not be rejection, I would highly recommend, at a minimum that the data sets be submitted SDTM, even if the study started before then. So, that's just kind of common sense that, trying to get your NDA approved or your IND approved early on is what you want to get done. So the standards that are optional up until that point, but highly favored.
Thanks, Angelo and Mark. And again, this is Mike Weitz, and we're getting some good questions here. We're going to extend our session to cover as many questions as we can and extend a few minutes beyond the top of the hour. One question received from Joe Marney starts this way. So he comments that we typically, at his company, recommend not pooling SDTM for integrated analysis submissions, but just to produce pooled ATOM data sets. Now, he says, so far this has been well received by the FDA and by sponsors, but he wonders what comments you might have on that particular approach, and how that might work for others, and if you have some comments about that approach. Angelo, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I can answer that. Well, there's no yet kind of consolidated standard approach on how to integrate data to create a pool analysis. There's some CDISC team working on it. They will probably come with some guidance, with some recommendation. But what I've seen so far with the different submissions where I've been involved, different approaches have been accepted by the FDA, provided there's always clear traceability. So at the moment, it's really a matter of sponsor preference, but also back to the question, if I well understood the approach used, the standard approach used that this company is pulled from Adam. So that's an option, provided that I understood the pulling from Adam is from individual study Adam. And this is a good approach if it's applicable, if it's feasible. So meaning that if the Adam data set developed for the individual study have been developed with the same principle. Otherwise, it may be difficult to pool them in a one pool Adam set.
Just to add on to this, that doesn't really surprise me, that input from our audience. We're seeing a lot of cases where the FDA is becoming a lot more collaborative and, suggesting things from a consulting perspective, including, how data sets are exchanged and whatnot. So, using the ADAM data set, which is clearly defined for analysis purposes, really doesn't surprise me. Kind of moves the ball forward in terms of where and when a sponsor would be engaging the FDA, because typically ADAM data sets are used, while the study is being conducted, not post-study. But that's something we probably discuss from a timeline perspective.
Thanks, Mark and Angelo. Sam Blackburn has an interesting question. And I think this might be a little bit toward Angelo. So Sam writes that Pinnacle 21 community/enterprise have separate checks for the PMDA and the FDA. So when you validate a study, is it good practice to check both sets of rules, or just run the rules at the region you plan to submit? In other words, if you're submitting to the PMDA, just run the PMDA checks.
Yeah, that's another good question. Probably it's probably best to start thinking globally. So even if you don't plan to submit to Japan, probably it's a good attitude to see how compliant would be your data set if one day will be submitted to PMDA. Well, that's one of the issues. I think at the next interchange there will be some company sharing their experience on that, also how they handled this issue. So a company that had to submit both authorities, how they handled the fact that they received different outcome when validating with FDA or PMDA validation checks.
Hi, Angelo and Mark. One more question here, and this would be to get your views from both of you. When should CDISC standards apply to device trials?
Well, they do now, although, the focus was on pharma and biotech. CDISC has very recently been putting a lot of effort in the device space. So while there's still a lot more room for interpretation and applying the CDISC standards in device trials, there are a number of customers that we work with that are in the process of, planning and building designs for implementing CDISC throughout their study, from their study design throughout execution. So it might be a little more challenging because, devices have some unique characteristics to them, but CDISC has really invested a lot of time and energy and spent a lot of time with the device companies trying to make those tweaks. And there is an implementation guide for CDISC for device as well.
Yes, correct. And also where there is a CDISC add-on team working on some topic related to ADAM when applied to devices. So there will be, I think there will be soon some document release for public review from CDISC about applying devices, ADAM for devices study. But as of today, there's no requirement for using the CDISC standard when submitting to the division in charge for devices at the FDA at least.
Thanks, Mark and Angelo. I'm afraid that we do have some additional questions, but we're just simply out of time for today. For those who did pose questions, we have documented them, and we will have a representative from Cytel contact you and to address your question. I did want to remind folks, especially in Europe and the UK, that Angelo will be making an appearance at the CDISC Interchange Europe meeting this year in Berlin later this month. Of course, you can find out more details about that by simply visiting cytel.com/events, which is, by the way, the same place where you'll find the download for today's slide sets for both Mark and Angelo. I'd also like to remind people to expect an email on Monday when the replay will become available. And, of course, we encourage you to share the replay and the slide sets with your colleagues. I'd like to conclude today by thanking everyone for joining us today. It was quite an excellent a number of people who joined the audience, and as encouraging as the number was the quality of questions and the interest. So I think we can really thank Mark and Angelo, Mark Vermette, again from the Halloran Group, and Cytel's own Angelo Tinazzi for their work and their presentations today, and working together to hopefully inform people better about the CDISC standards and the adoption and the optimal way to move forward through your clinical development. And with that, we'll say good day, good evening, wherever you are, and I hope you'll join us again on another Cytel webinar. Thank you.